I don't know of a worse place than this anywhere on Earth. You feel a sense of evil hanging over it wherever you go. Auschwitz was the focus, the heart of the Holocaust. Far more Jews died here than any other group, but unthinkable numbers of Poles and gays and Roma gypsies were also put to death here in the cruelest ways. And it all happened so recently, within my own lifetime. We all know the images. They've become part of our collective consciousness. The apparatus of death, the mocking sign, work makes you free, the arch through which nobody returns. Each new consignment of prisoners would be brought along this line, jammed 100 at a time into each cattle truck, 12,000 people every day. I find it impossible to imagine the screaming of the guards, the barking of the dogs. Here was the ramp where the selection took place. Who was to die immediately, who was not. 1 in 5 went to the labor camp, and the rest straight to the gas chambers. "700 people could be crammed in here to die, and you could still see the marks of their fingernails on the walls as they did so. It's bitterly cold and silent in here now, but you can imagine how hellish the atmosphere must have been. Even now, the ceilings and the walls are encrusted with soot. The word Holocaust, after all, means destruction by fire. At the end, the Nazis tried to obliterate Auschwitz. All around us here lie the ashes of countless tens of thousands of people. But they haven't been obliterated, and they haven't been forgotten. Which is why tonight we're commemorating Holocaust Memorial Day. Earlier today in Poland, 1,000 survivors and relatives walked back along the railway tracks to Auschwitz-Birkenau. Shrouded in mist, carrying wreaths and flags, they brought their memories. Some of them wore the badges they'd been forced to wear then. At the memorial, the wreaths were laid, and they paid their respects to those who died. Now, the survivors could come and go through those terrible gates as free men and women. And in London tonight, we're coming live from Methodist Central Hall, Westminster, to mark Holocaust Memorial Day in the United Kingdom. And in the audience tonight, as it gathers, we have nearly 2,000 people altogether, among them a couple of hundred survivors from the camps, the leaders of many religious groups, people from the Jewish and other communities, and leaders of all the political parties. And here in the audience are particular survivors, Ruth Foster, for instance, whose father was shot in front of her in 1942, and whose mother was taken away and killed. When the camp was liberated, she weighed 3.5 stone. Freddie Knoller, an Austrian who worked for the French resistance and was sent to Auschwitz and then on to Bergen-Belsen. Leon Greenman, born in Britain, who was taken to Auschwitz with his wife and son. They both died. He survived. And General Vasily Petrenko, in his uniform, who 56 years ago was among the first wave of Soviet troops to reach Auschwitz. He told us he remembered most the piles of suitcases and boots and hair, how meticulous the Nazi death machine had been. But what about our own attitudes in this country? Do we have that much to pride ourselves on? Britain's record wasn't entirely an impressive one in taking in the Jews who were persecuted once Hitler took power in 1933. The British government was reluctant to allow many Jewish refugees into the country. In Britain, Hitler's persecution of the Jews provoked outrage among the Jewish community.
Let us fight together against Hitler. in the name of Liebe.
Given the high unemployment, the government refused to change the strict immigration laws to allow Jewish refugees into the country. So British Jews took on full responsibility for them and promised the refugees wouldn't be a burden on the state. But in Britain, as in other European countries, anti-Jewish feeling was rising. Oswald Mosley's British Union of Fascists openly supported Hitler's anti-Jewish policy and was gaining popular support. In 1936, Mosley's Black Shirts launched a campaign against the Jewish population of London's East End. It erupted into violence.
Fighting now spreads to the Mint. Sir Oswald Mosley was informed by the police commissioner, Sir Philip Keane, that to avert serious bloodshed, the march would ban.
Still, from 1938, Britain let in thousands of refugees, particularly after Kristallnacht, when Jews in Germany and Austria were terrorized. But the influx of refugees into Britain divided public opinion. Some newspapers, citing high unemployment, stirred up anti-Jewish feeling. Jewish leaders, though, insisted the refugees wouldn't cost the country anything.
We are going to collect all the money we can to help those poor people, particularly the young ones. We are going to see that they are no burden on those good countries who have promised to take some of them in.
By the outbreak of war, well over 60,000 Jews had entered Britain, but more lives could have been saved. The fact is, they weren't. And with us in Central Hall, Westminster tonight are a number of those children. Kindertransports, as they were known. Among them is Sue Medas, who came originally from the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia. She was a teenager at the time. And then close by her is Lord Alf Dubs. He was only 6 when he originally came here. He eventually became a Labour MP and a government minister. And there's Hannes Schnabel, another Kindertransport, whose brother was due to leave on the first day of the war, but had to stay behind and died. In our audience tonight, for what is, after all, a major national occasion, are a number of ambassadors. 60 or so countries are represented here. Among them are the Israeli ambassador, the Turkish ambassador, and of course there's been plenty of controversy about Armenia's involvement in this commemoration, and the Armenian ambassador. And there's the German ambassador too. But when we consider the horrors of the 20th century, it's perhaps worth recalling that there's scarcely anything the Nazis did to the Jews which hadn't been done to them in medieval England. The English led the way in cruelty. Jews first came to England with William the Conqueror. Most were moneylenders, since by law Christians were forbidden to loan money. This made them extremely unpopular. They were often accused of kidnapping and crucifying Christian children to use their blood in religious celebrations. In 1189, the word Holocaust was used to describe a massacre of Jews in London. There were attacks on them all over England. The worst was at York. 150 Jews trapped inside a burning tower died, rather than face the angry mob outside. Edward I even forced the Jews to wear yellow identity badges, and in 1290 he expelled them from England altogether. This was the first time that an entire Jewish population had been expelled from any country in medieval Europe. The Jews were barred from England for the next 350 years. So it seems that none of us ever learns the lesson properly. But of course it took the industrial skills and communication systems of the 20th century to turn prejudice and massacre into the basic purpose of government. This evening has inevitably created controversy. There was a large question about whether every 20th century genocide would be mentioned here. Well, maybe it won't be mentioned individually, but it's possible at the moment to reflect on many of them. For instance, would the genocide of 1 million or more Armenians be ignored? And
There I can see Yervant Shakademian, who survived that massacre. It turned out that a Turkish soldier recognized him and let him free. There is a problem. The Turks deny that any such massacre happened. Then there's the Bishop of the Armenian Church in Britain, Natan Hovhannisyan. But, of course, there are so many other genocides this century. There is, of course, for instance, the ongoing attempt to wipe out Tibet as an independent country. 1.2 million Tibetans died after the Chinese invasion, which began in 1949. These things cannot be forgotten. East Timor, 200,000 dead in 25 years. We'll be hearing about many other of these kind of genocides this evening. And of course, there are the terrible genocides of the past decades. Serbs against Muslims, Hutus against Tutsis in Rwanda. And there are older ones which we mustn't forget either. Massacres of Serbs by Croats during the war, for instance, part of that terrible tit-for-tat series of killings in the Balkans. Many religious leaders here tonight, not just simply the ones that I've named, but Archbishop Grigore, for instance, of Greece. And I can see Mrs. Cinnamon, the Hasidic Jewish representative here tonight. We have the Mayor and Mayoress of Westminster just now taking their seats for the beginning of the occasion. Resplendent figure there. And we're now waiting for the main guests of the evening. It's perhaps worth remembering that Sweden, Germany, Italy, Scotland have their Holocaust Memorial Days today. Sherry Blair, the Prime Minister's wife. And now we're expecting the principal guests, and there they are. Among them, of course, the Prime Minister, Tony Blair, strong supporter of the idea of Holocaust Memorial Day, followed by the Conservative leader William Hague. The political leaders there, Charles Kennedy, Liberal Democrats. I can see Seamus Mallon, the Deputy First Minister for Northern Ireland. Rhodri Morgan, First Secretary for the Welsh Assembly. And we also have the religious leaders, of course, too. There's Cormac Murphy O'Connor, the Archbishop of Westminster, recently made a cardinal. The Archbishop of Canterbury, and Dr. Jonathan Sachs, the Chief Rabbi, sitting next to him, representative of many Jews in this country. And now the Prince of Wales, principal guest. His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales walks down, people standing, accompanied by Jack Straw, the Home Secretary. Taking their seats now. And the ceremony will now shortly begin. A commemorative flame will now be lit by Rita Sahachu from the Voices Foundation Children's Choir. They'll be singing later in the event. Rita was born in Kosovo. She's 10 years old. She came to Britain with her parents when she was 2. She's been singing with the choir for 2 years, and she'll light the commemorative flame.
In a century of mass murder, over 170 million innocent human beings have been wiped off the face of the earth. Today we remember them.
The actress Emma Thompson will read Oh, the Chimneys, a poem about Auschwitz by Nelly Sachs, a German Jewish poet and playwright who escaped the Nazis in 1940.
Oh, the chimneys on the ingeniously devised habitations of death. When Israel's body drifted as smoke through the air, was welcomed by a star, a chimney sweep, a star that turned black. Or was it a ray of sun? Oh, the chimneys. Freedom for Jeremiah and Job's dust. Who devised you? Laid stone upon stone, the road for refugees of smoke. Oh, the habitations of death, invitingly appointed for the host, who used to be a guest. Oh, you fingers, laying the threshold like a knife between life and death. Oh, you chimneys. Oh, you fingers. And Israel's body as smoke through the air.
For the 8 million Jews of Europe, January the 30th, 1933 was a date with a fearful destiny. As Adolf Hitler swept to power in Germany, the fate of those unable to escape to sanctuary abroad was sealed. Despite having assimilated into every region of Europe and fought and died in its national armies, the Jews were a people singled out for annihilation. Soon came the burning of the books. In a few short years, they'd be burning people. With the passing of the Nuremberg laws, the elimination of the Jew from German life became official government policy. Murder followed. On Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, 91 Jews were killed in an orgy of looting and violence. 11 months later, Germany invaded Poland. Cut off from the outside world, the ghetto Jews of Warsaw, Riga, Lodz, and numerous other sites died in their tens of thousands. Then the genocide began in earnest. Einsatzgruppen, SS killing squads, wiped out entire communities. But shooting, hanging, burning, and starvation were deemed inefficient. To achieve slaughter on an industrial scale, murder by poison gas was added. The final solution, the obliteration of an entire race. Chełmno, Białystok, Sobibor, Treblinka, Male Trostinets, Majdanek, Auschwitz-Birkenau, names forever seared in the Jewish consciousness. By the end, 6 million had died. As a survivor later reflected, it has been the lot of the Jews to deliver to men a warning that violence is in the end self-destructive, power futile, and the human spirit unconquerable.
When war broke out, the Germans came and everything changed. All the Jewish leaders were rounded up and shot. We had to wear a star and walk in the gutter.
On the 1st of May, 1940, the entire Jewish population of my hometown 180,000 people were herded into a barbed wire enclosure. This was the infamous Lodge Ghetto. All contact with the outside world ceased for us on that day. Escape was impossible.
One day, I was walking back from an errand and I heard shooting. Being curious, I cut across the forest, made my way to the ravine, where I saw my Jewish friends being used for target practice. One of the SS recruits doing the shooting was a boy I knew well from school, though he was a bit older than I. We sometimes played together. Now he was shooting Jewish boys and girls.
August 1944. The Lodge Ghetto was liquidated and we were deported, destination unknown. We were shoved into closed cattle trucks. We were pressed together. There was no room to move and hardly any air to breathe. People all around me were fainting. After 2 days of stopping and starting, many were dead.
We arrived at Auschwitz-Birkenau at dawn. We did not know what the place was. Suddenly, we were gripped with fear. Some were hugging each other, others were praying or just quietly sobbing.
We were told to form queues for selection. Someone said to me, "Say you are 19, not 16. When my mother was asked her age, she said 44. Alas, she was too old to be selected for life. I lied and said I was 19 and was pushed to the other side. That was the last time I saw my mother. Even after I had seen the gas chambers with the smoke rising from the chimneys, I told myself she was still alive. I had to believe it in order to carry on.
In this selection, 500 of us metal workers were placed on one side. The other 2,300 who arrived with us were marched off immediately. My group stood there till dusk. We could smell the smell of burning flesh coming from the crematorium. We didn't realize it, but those we had arrived with were already dead.
January 1945, I found myself in Belsen, another kind of hell. One day, I saw an SS officer amusing himself with some prisoners. He made them sing and dance, and later he made them count. When each man got to the 10, he shot them. It was like a world gone mad.
Towards the end of the war, we were forced to join the death march. One night, 3 of us escaped. We were taken in by Mr. and Mrs. Fuchs, who looked after us, found us work. Then, when the Russians came, I went back home to see if anyone from my family was still alive. They were all dead. From 800 Jewish people who lived in Hodge, my town, before the war, only 4 of us survived. Some weeks later, I returned with a few modest gifts to say thank you to Mr. and Mrs. Fuchs. Mrs. Fuchs was in black. When the local SS learned that they sheltered Jews, they came and shot Mr. Fuchs and one of my colleagues, although it was now over.
Typhus was rampant in Belsen. One day, I lost consciousness at work. I was told my friends dragged me to the isolation block. I do not remember the day of liberation. When I came to, I found 4 portions of bread and some tins of condensed milk on my bunk. I burst out crying. For nearly 6 years, I dreamed of the moment when I would be able to eat and eat, but I was too ill to swallow a crumb. The 3 women on my bunk were dead.
My grandfather was too weak to survive the Lodz ghetto. He knew he was dying and said to me, "Tell the world what is happening. Don't emotionalize or embellish it. Just tell the facts."
The testimony of 2 Holocaust survivors, Roman Halter and Esten Brunstein. Now we'll hear In Memoriam Anne Frank, a piece of music written to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the death of Anne Frank, the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. 120 children from all over Britain are singing in this choir. The Voices Foundation, their choir, is an organisation that transforms children through singing and developing their self-esteem and tolerance and racial integration. Anne Frank and her family were hidden in Amsterdam for 2 years. Then she died at Belsen concentration camp at the age of 15. Remember me when I am gone away. That was In Memoriam and Frank by the Voices Foundation Choir, directed by Susan Digby. Some of the singers themselves were no more than 15, the age when Anne died, just a few months before Belsen was liberated. For those who saw that liberation and saw the camp for the first time, it was a horrific experience. Even now, the images are terrible to watch.
The BBC's Richard Dimbleby was the first war correspondent to enter Belsen in April 1945. Here is his report.
I have just returned from the Belsen concentration camp. I find it hard to describe adequately the horrible things that I've seen and heard. But here, unadorned, are the facts. I passed through the barrier and found myself in the world of a nightmare. All around was this awful drifting tide of exhausted people, and I had to look hard to see who was alive and who was dead. In the shade of some trees lay a great collection of bodies, all naked, all so thin that their yellow skin glistened like stretched rubber on their bones. Some looked so utterly unreal and inhuman that I could have imagined that they had never lived at all. As we went deeper into the camp, we saw the crematorium, where the Germans had burned alive thousands of men and women in a single fire. The SS guards, who shot several of the prisoners after we'd arrived in the camp when they thought no one was looking, are now gathering up all the bodies and carting them away for burial. Every fact I've so far given you has been verified, but there is one more awful than all the others that I've kept to the end. Far away in a corner of Belsen camp, there is a pit, and at one end, it's piled to the very top with naked bodies. Our army doctors found in their sides a long slit. In the frenzy of their starvation, some of the people of Belsen had taken the wasted bodies of their fellow prisoners and had removed from them the only remaining flesh, the liver and the kidneys, to eat. Those are the simple, horrible facts of Belsen.
And in our audience is Major Richard Williams, formerly of the British 8th Corps, 23 at the time when he was one of the liberators of Bergen-Belsen. And not far away, Rudy and Eve Oppenheimer, brother and sister, who survived Belsen, though both their parents died there. Sir Ian McKellen comes forward to pay his tribute to another group who died in the camps. Sir Ian's a founder member of the gay rights organisation Stonewall.
Every individual in every camp had a story, and here's one of them. Pierre Seal was a teenager living with his family in the Alsace region of France. His parents ran a patisserie, and he was working as a window dresser when the Nazis arrived in Alsace in 1940. He was ordered to report to Gestapo headquarters because Pierre Seal was homosexual. He was tortured, then sent to a concentration camp, and he wrote, "One day the loudspeakers ordered us to report immediately to the roll call site. 2 SS men brought a young man to the center of our square, and horrified I recognized Joe, my loving friend who was only 18 years old. I'd prayed he would escape their lists, their roundups, their humiliations, and there he was, before my powerless eyes, which filled with tears. What happened? What had the monsters accused him of? And then the loudspeakers broadcast some noisy classical music while the SS stripped him naked and shoved a tin pail over his head. And next they set their ferocious German shepherd dogs on him. His shrieks of pain were distorted and amplified by the pail in which his head was trapped. Jews had to wear yellow stars, but inside the camps there was a different badge for each category of prisoner, an obscene geometry of stars and triangles, yellow, red, green, and pink for gays like Pierre Seal and his friend. Hitler's goal was to perfect the Aryan master race, using all the apparatus of the Nazi state to exclude those whose differences marked them out as some sort of threat. Specious scientific tests were used to justify the selection of minority groups for persecution, incarceration, and death. It started with the so-called euthanasia program for people with learning disabilities and mental illnesses, and later, alongside Jews, gypsies, homosexuals, black Germans, physically disabled people, non-Jewish Poles, Serbs and Slavs, but equally dissenters too, such as Jehovah's Witnesses, Christian clerics, and Marxists. Like the Jews, the Roma and Sinti gypsies faced total annihilation. The historian François Baderrida wrote, "They were forced to do the most degrading and most arduous work. Thus, a gypsy woman whose entire family had been gassed was used to carry the dead, and together with other internees, she had to gather the corpses at the execution site and carry them to the ditch, where the prisoners were often still alive, though barely. They were finished off with a bullet in the back of the neck." 200,000 Sinti and Roma gypsies were murdered by the Nazis. How many gays perished? How many Serbs, Slavs, people with disabilities? No one knows exact numbers, but their slaughter was real, their suffering profound, and their fate, like that of the Jews, defies comprehension. Theirs was the forgotten Holocaust.
And now the Andrusia Ensemble play part of a string trio by Gideon Klein, who was born in Czechoslovakia and died at the age of 26 in a concentration camp on the very threshold of freedom. Bob Geldof, who received an honorary knighthood for his work on behalf of famine victims, pays tribute now to the British righteous who saved Jewish lives.
I cannot even begin to imagine the towering morality nor the almost fantastical bravery of the luminous few who, seeing the evil, were compelled against the most dangerous odds to exemplary humanity. They are indeed righteous among the nations, as the Israelis have so honoured them. By their actions, they not only saved the doomed, but us as well. They became, through their deeds, our living conscience. We know through them that resistance to the monstrous is not only necessary and possible, but is indeed an obligation. That we too, in the circumstances, cannot pass by, but resist the oppressive state and the foul tyrant and their murderous racisms. That we too can reduce the putrid industrial killings, the cowardly bullet and bayonet, the mad state-sponsored starvations, to the banal and sickening and pitiful evil that we consider today. Incredibly, some of these heroes are still alive, and not one of us in this room, save those they helped and the other survivors, are fit to be amongst these giants, though characteristically they don't understand the fuss. They don't believe that they did anything exceptional, but that is exactly what they did, and it is precisely what they are. For if we all behaved as them, genocide would have been a crime of the past and not the contemporary sickness that we still bear witness to. In front of them, we pray that we should never be called upon as they were. But should we be, we pray harder that somehow we may find a fraction of their strength, and acting as they did, illuminate our humanity in the very darkest moments of our existence. George Hammond was one of a group of British prisoners of war who saved a starving Jewish girl during the death marches. They hid her in the roof space of their prison hut and fed her from their rations. They knew, of course, they'd be shot if she was found. The rest of the group, Alan Edwards, Tommy Noble, Stan Wells and Roger Letchford, have all since passed away. But tonight we can pay our respects and our thanks to them and to George. And maybe we might think of them when we have moral choices to make, for it is certain ours will never be harder than theirs. And there's someone else here tonight who helped save lives. He too saw what needed to be done, and he did it.
When I was a little girl, my life was idyllic, actually. I had a special relationship with Mother. I can, to this day, feel her arms around me as I did when I was a little girl.
Hitler's invasion of the Czech borders forced thousands of families towards Prague.
A lot of the refugees were in innocent huts in camps, and anybody who visited those camps at the time, in freezing cold, hard snow outside, knew what it was like for these people. And we felt that their days were numbered. And that's really what kind of started me on it.
Mother heard of a committee and that they were trying to get endangered children out to Britain.
I went back to London, went to the Home Office and said, under what conditions can I bring in from Czechoslovakia? And they made no problems at all. My only problem was finding the families to look after the children.
It wasn't until about a month later that Mother said, I heard today that Vera can go to England. Father looked absolutely stunned.
I mean, if you were a married man with a young child of 3 or 4 and you were taking it to a station with a chance of never seeing it again, you just have to imagine what the scenes were like. They must have been quite frightful, quite awful, quite awful.
But our parents kept a smile on their faces right till the train started to leave the station. And then a look of desolation spread across their faces as we were leaving, and suddenly I felt afraid. It was the last time I saw my parents.
Some Jewish children went to Christian homes, which angered certain critics.
I suppose it's only right to say anybody who'd take a child I said yes to. I mean, it all sounds frightful in retrospect, you know. But as I've said so often, well, at least they were alive at the end of the war, and otherwise they wouldn't have been.
As one of the refugee children from Prague, I owe my life to Nicholas Winton. But he could not have succeeded without help from others. When my foster mother came to claim me, her first words were, "You shall be loved." And those are the most important words any refugee child needs to hear. Years later, I asked my foster father, why did he choose me? And he said, "I knew I could not save the world. I knew I could not stop the war from starting. But I knew I could save one human soul." And as Chamberlain broke his pledge to Czechoslovakia, and as Jews were in the direst danger, he decided it must be a Czech Jewish child. Tonight, I'd like to speak directly to children and young people. If you ever come to a time in your life when help is needed, think of me and of the 669 children who owe their lives to the moral courage of others. At the time, none of us knew how lucky we were, but now we know. Over 15,000 Czech Jewish children went through the camps, and only a tiny fraction survived. Nicky and his team saved the greater part of my generation, and not just us, but our children and grandchildren. And he is with us tonight.
And Vera Gissing and Bob Geldof go down to thank the man who saved her life. But, as we know, genocide was one of the defining characteristics of the 20th century, not only against the Jews, but against so many other groups, as Sir Anthony Sher reminds us.
Let's think back to 1945, VE Day, and the overwhelming relief of knowing the war was at an end. But in mainland Europe, the cries of joy were still born, cut dead by the revelation of Nazi horrors as the concentration camps opened their doors to the world. A procession of weeping Germans was forced to view the crimes which had been committed in their name. The shame of shared guilt for the crime of genocide was unavoidable. The evidence was there for all to see. The Jewish community said, "Never again." And the world said it too. We said never again after the Khmer Rouge brutalized the people of Cambodia in their killing fields. We said never again, but couldn't stop the massacre of Rwanda's Tutsis or the Hutus who sheltered them. The world said never again, but couldn't defend Bosnia against the tyranny of Karadzic and his Bosnian Serbs. It's easy to say never again. Let us now consider the post-war experience through three events which sadly are emblematic of many more.
I'm full of fear, Sydney. I must show no understanding, not of French or English. I must have no past, Sydney. This is the year zero, and nothing has gone before. The wind whispers of fear and hate. The war has killed love, Sydney, and those who confess to to the hunger vanish, and no one dare ask where they go. Here, only the silent survive.
On April the 17th, 1975, my family and I were forced out of our home at gunpoint as Khmer Rouge troops emptied the cities. Pol Pot had taken powers of Cambodia, bringing his fundamentalist brand of communism and hatred of intellectuals. As a teacher, I was definitely in danger. The main highways were clogged with a human traffic of up to 3 million people, crying children separated from their parents, patients still bleeding in their hospital beds being pushed along by relatives. Our entire fabric of life had been torn apart. The Khmer Rouge were determined to return the country to year zero, a primitive peasant economy. After traveling for over a month on foot, we reached the villages. Everybody, including children and my blind mother, were set to work digging reservoirs and irrigation canals on starvation rations. When the rice planting season came, my day began at 4 as we trudged numbly to the fields in the dark. At sunset, we returned for our evening meal, a thin rice gruel, followed by endless propaganda lessons. Then, off to the field again, working in the dark till midnight. If one escaped murder, the back-breaking labor in harsh conditions, compounded by malnutrition and untreated diseases, resulted in very few survivors. Simply wearing glasses or a watch could result in accusation of being an intellectual or a capitalist. These people were tortured until they confessed their guilt and then killed. Open mass graves were close to the village as a warning to everyone. Thanks to God's love and protection, my mother, my 2 girls, and I survived the 4 years of hardship, starvation, and disease. Many did not.
In his award-winning reports for Panorama, Fergal Keane brought home the full horror of the genocide in Rwanda in 1994.
Rwanda, the country where some of the worst crimes against humanity of this century have been committed. Below me in the waters of the Kagera River is stark evidence of what's been happening here. Evidence of Rwanda's journey into darkness.
In 100 days, more than 800,000 people were to die. I had seen war before, had seen the face of cruelty, but Nyarabuye belonged in a nightmare zone, where my capacity to understand, to rationalize, was overwhelmed. The victims, all of them Tutsis, had gone to the church in search of sanctuary. Instead, the house of God became a killing ground.
You don't just see death here, you feel it and you smell it. It is as if all the good and life in the atmosphere had been sucked out and replaced with the stench of evil.
In a classroom, a mother and her children made easy targets. Here, babies grabbed from their dying parents were thrust headfirst to suffocate in dark pits. This is the ruined hand of 15-year-old Valentina. She sustained these injuries trying to ward off the blows of a machete. She has little chance of survival. This is what adults did to children at Nyarabuye. It is hard now to imagine the atmosphere of hatred created by the state and by radio. Men like these, husbands and fathers, were told that it was their civic duty to kill the Tutsi cockroaches, and the killers were certain they could get away with it.
There are 2 thoughts then, that of the people who knew they were going to die and the mortal terror they must have felt, and of the savagery and hatred in the hearts of those who were going to kill them. I have a friend called Esther Mujwayo. At the height of the slaughter, she and her husband and 3 daughters were captured. The women were put to one side. A small boy tried to shelter with them, but he was discovered and sent with the men. The men were marched away and killed. Esther and her daughters amazingly survived the genocide. A few months ago, Esther found one of her children standing in the garden, staring intently at the sky. "What are you doing?" she asked. "I'm waiting for Daddy," her daughter replied. "You told me that he had gone up to the sky." When Esther Mujwaya was fleeing in terror, the leaders of the most powerful nations on earth, our own country among them, looked the other way. 1 million people were butchered, but the world refused to act. Consider that 50 years after Auschwitz, European soldiers abandoned several thousand terrified men, women and children at the Kigali Technical School. As the troops drove out, the killers came in. We knew, and we did nothing. And so you might ask, is there any purpose to the act of witness? If in this, the worst genocide since the Holocaust, eyewitness accounts could not rouse good men to action. We bear witness tonight for Esther Mujwaya and the other widows of the genocide. We say to them, you are not forgotten, your dead are not forgotten. They are more than rags and bones heaped in mass graves across your beautiful country. They are not, as Hitler said of the victims of the Armenian genocide, merely biological plasticine. We bear witness tonight so that every time you hear powerful men scapegoating people because of their race or religion, you pause for thought. Every time you hear the minority, the outsider, the refugee demeaned and denigrated, you pause for thought. And in that pause, remember how genocide begins, and remember exactly where it takes us. Now, from Rwanda, Cecile Kayirebwe and her band with Ubupfubyi, Being an Orphan.
ntizicabira
Cecile Kayirebwe with the song of a Rwandan orphan who survived the genocide. Everything stopped moving, she said. Have I stopped existing? Zlata Filipovic, born in Sarajevo and now studying at Oxford, talks of the genocide in her native Bosnia.
Two months before the war started, I was playing in the park next to my house. People started asking, who are you, what are you? I had to go back to my parents and ask them who I am or what I am, because apparently you suddenly had to be something. Everything changed, you know. There was a month of kind of transition, and then from the 2nd May 92 onwards, it was really war. Ethnic cleansing was yet another of these words and terms I've learned because of the war, and I wish I hadn't. In a way, it sounds quite sort of sterile and like it's not actually happening to actual people.
July 95, the Muslim town of Srebrenica saw the worst act of genocide in Europe since 1945. 8,000 men separated from their families and never seen again.
Srebrenica things comes to mind when you think of trails of women who still at this stage don't know where their men, their husbands, their brothers, their sons are.
Only 3,000 bodies have ever been recovered.
You know, these people were expelled from their homes, you know, went through torture, and no one in the world deserves that. You start drawing parallels between all conflicts, because you had something like this in the Second World War. There are those concentration camps, there are expulsions. Why do people not learn from the mistakes?
I was there at Tomarska. I was born in 1968 in a village called Kevljani in Bosnia. I am a Muslim, but we mixed with nearby Serb and Croat villages. When the soldiers came, they took most of me into Omarska concentration camp. It's a story you've heard already tonight. Primitive, filthy conditions, brutality, beatings, torture, murder. The worst orgy of violence happened on the 17th June 1992. In the late afternoon, terrible screams could be heard all around the camp. There was also laughter. Somebody was being tortured. Later we heard what happened. A man was made to drink motor oil, then ordered to kneel before another man and bit off his testicles. One died in agony, the other will live with the horror for the rest of his life. And the people doing this, the camp guards, were our neighbors. Our fathers worked together. Our mothers went to the same market. It's true we had different religious beliefs and customs, but I never went to sleep worried I would be murdered in my bed by a Serb. So, where had it come from, this hatred? On the first night of my imprisonment, one of the Serbs said to us, "We had to do this to you because you Muslims are planning to murder our children." The vicious seeds of propaganda had been planted in his mind. Most concentration camp victims do not know their captors, but we did. And we knew them not as brutes, but as ordinary people like ourselves. But when one group of people stop seeing another group as humans, it's the first step to genocide. And the problem is, everybody talks about it afterwards. But while it's happening, nobody cares. It all just becomes a question of national self-interest. And ordinary people just get trampled on.
The Holocaust of the Jews, though, is, of course, the central genocide of the 20th century. Dr. Jonathan Sacks, Chief Rabbi of the United Hebrew Congregations of the Commonwealth, speaks for ordinary Jews.
The rabbis said that one who destroys a single life destroys a universe. What then shall we say of the millions of innocent lives destroyed in the Holocaust? On scraps of paper buried in the ground, the victims of Auschwitz left one last message to us: Zachor, remember. Not in hate or anger or desire for revenge, but simply so that what happened once should never happen again. What we forget, we can repeat. Memory is the moral guardian of mankind. Yet ethnic violence has not ended. It happened again in Cambodia, Bosnia, Rwanda, wherever men and women and children are killed because of the simple fact that they are different. What makes attempted genocide uniquely evil is that it's a crime against the very condition of our humanity itself, our difference, the diversity that makes every human life irreplaceable. Which is why we must never forget that God has given us many faiths, many races, but only one world in which to live together. May we recognize his image in those who are not in our image. And may the memory of those who died teach us to sanctify life.
Dr. Jonathan Sacks, leader of Britain's Orthodox Jews.
Keane.
Moshe Hashel with the Ne'ima singers sang Al Male Rachamim, Jewish memorial prayer for the 6 million who perished in the Holocaust.
The Holocaust was the most hideous act of collective evil in our history. So what then can we learn from it and from the other racial genocides? First, that human beings are indeed capable of such evil, that it happened in my father's lifetime under the Nazis, that it was repeated in Cambodia and Rwanda in my own lifetime, and again in the Balkans in the lifetime of my children. Second, that racism must be fought against the moment that it appears, that what permits racial genocide is as much the indifference, the attitudes of abstention, as much as the acts of violence. Later tonight, the BBC will screen Schindler's List, a profound and impressive film. And the most shocking scene to me was where the concentration camp commander is with his girlfriend and they are arguing as couples do, but then casually he picks up a gun and shoots a Jew from his window in the camp below. She pays no attention. It is not her business. It is not the perpetrators alone who bear guilt. It is the blind eye-turners, the people who would shrink from cruelty themselves but cannot summon up the moral force to prevent it in others. And third, that we must be on our guard because, strangely, the origins of this racism can lie in something we all seek, which is a sense of belonging. We want to belong to our family, to our community, to our country, our religion. We value this, and rightly. But we must never let our desire to belong be a reason to exclude. I remember talking to people in Kosovo who would tell me how for years they'd lived next door to each other, Albanians and Serbs. Their children played together, their families ate their evening meal together. But when the soldiers came, the same family pointed them out and helped the murder of their young men and the rape of their women. So let our sense of belonging never justify, in our own minds, superiority. Let us celebrate our diversity, but do so on the basis of the fundamental belief that we are all of equal worth, above all else, members of the human race. Fourth, that we can hope, because fascism was defeated. Europe has been at peace for over half a century. Good can win, if we will it to do so. And the fact that we are here this evening shows it. Fifth, that how much we must teach our children about these events, the Holocaust, racism, and genocide. That if we do not remember our history, we will repeat it. Let not one life sacrificed in the Holocaust be in vain. Let each death stay in our minds and those of our children as a monument to our capacity to do evil and our desire to do good. And finally, let us understand the importance of our spiritual values, that these matter more in the end than either material wealth or indeed political ideology. For all the wrong that the perversion of religious faith can do, it is a society without spiritual values that is a society at risk. We have our different faiths, but in each, at the heart of each, is a sense of the value of each human being. So let our religions not be as a tribe to us, but as our spiritual guide. So in remembering the Holocaust and its victims, we recommit ourselves this evening to the kind of society that we believe in. A democratic, a just and a tolerant society. A society where everyone's worth is respected, regardless of their race or religion or the color of their skin. A society where each of us demonstrates by our words and actions our commitment to the best, most decent values of humanity and compassion. A society that has the courage to confront prejudice and persecution. This is indeed our hope, and that is why the Holocaust deserves this permanent place in our collective memory.
The broadcaster, Sir Trevor McDonald, from ITN, one of the country's most respected journalists, will now come forward and read a poem.
The poet Stephen Spender wrote, "I think continually of those who were truly great, who from the womb remembered the soul's history through corridors of light, where the hours are suns, endless and singing." Well, most of us don't think of ourselves as truly great, but we all wish to be on the side of good against evil. If tested, we all hope to make the brave choices to show that we too have that quality of moral courage. But is there a guide to righteousness? What are its rules? What's its foundation? The 44 nations who gathered in Stockholm 1 year ago wanted to ensure that the lessons of history are passed to future generations. Their conclusions have been distilled into 7 clear statements of commitment, and here they are.
The Holocaust has changed our lives forever.
We must never forget.
We will respect survivors.
We will honour those who risk their own lives for others.
We will fight prejudice.
And we will fight discrimination.
We will teach the lessons of the Holocaust.
We will mark National Holocaust Memorial Day.
Tonight, we're lighting candles in memory of those who were murdered. These flames also symbolize our hopes for the future. I'd like to invite Ben Helfgott, chairman of the 45 Aid Society Holocaust Survivors, to speak now.
It's moving and gratifying for Holocaust survivors to see the day when Her Majesty's government has seen fit to recognize the necessity of an annual Holocaust Memorial Day. Sadly, we need to be constantly reminded that intolerance in all its forms inevitably leads to a breakdown in civilized society. By signposting the significance of this day, the government has clearly pointed to the responsibility we all have, not only to each other, but for ourselves and for society at large. I now have the great honor of calling upon His Royal Highness, the Prince of Wales, to light the first candle in memory of all those who have died.
Prince Charles lighting his candle on behalf of the nation. Ben Helfgott, himself a slave labourer and a survivor of Buchenwald camp. Now other religious leaders coming forward. The Chief Rabbi, Dr. Jonathan Sachs. They're accompanied by children from local schools. Dr. Sachs lights his. There's the Archbishop of Canterbury coming forward. Sheikh Zaki Badawi, principal of the Muslim College. Rabbi Jonathan Rayner, president of the Liberal and Progressive Synagogues. The Archbishop of Westminster, Cormac Murphy O'Connor. He's just been elected a cardinal. His Grace Bishop Natan Hovhannissian from the Armenian Church. Sudarshan Bhatia from the National Council of Hindu Temples. The Reverend Inderjit Bogal, President of the Methodist Conference. And of course, we're in their hall tonight. Ranniknal Shah from the Institute of Jainology, ancient Indian religion with 25,000 followers in Britain. Inderjit Singh, the chairman of the network of Sikh organizations, familiar to many of us from Radio 4. Carmel Monen, representing the Baha'i faith, so often persecuted throughout the Islamic world. Reverend Anthony Burnham, the moderator of the Free Churches Council.
I believe in God. Though he is silent.
Etta Sumerman from the Hasidic Jewish community, a very strict and very observant branch of Judaism. Tony Blair. The opposition, William Hague. This music comes from the most extraordinary place. The words were found on the walls of a cave in Cologne where Jews were hiding. Charles Kennedy, leader of the Liberal Democrats. Jim Wallace, the Deputy First Minister for Scotland. So as the final candles commemorating those who have been killed in genocides are lit by people who have taken part in this evening's commemoration, it brings to an end this first Holocaust Memorial Day in Britain. We've seen and heard terrible testimonies here tonight. But perhaps for us here and for many of you at home, the real question is, what do we as individuals need to do to stop any of this ever happening again? There aren't any easy answers, but it is a question we must ask ourselves.